Welcome to this special edition of Spectator TV, sponsored by the Initiative for Free Trade. I'm Andrew Neil, and today we'll focus on financial and economic sanctions and ask the question, do global sanctions really work? Sanctions are often praised as an alternative to military intervention. Instead of boots on the ground, economic pressure is applied to change a country's behavior or to penalize those at the top of an unsavory regime behaving in ways of which we disapprove. But do they work? There are various sanctions against China, Iran, and Venezuela, to take just three examples, largely American-inspired, but all three dictatorships seem to be functioning well enough to keep their authoritarian leaders in power and their agendas still alive. Yet still, the West resorts to sanctions. Just yesterday, it was announced that the British Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, is set to follow in the steps of the United States and the European Union by implementing sanctions against China over the country's abuse of the Uyghur minority, including travel bans and asset freezes against 4 senior officials, some called even tougher sanctions. Supporters of sanctions say they should always be targeted and well designed. That seems to be the way they're going. But even when they are they effective? If sanctions force rogue states and human rights abusers to change their ways, few would be likely to object to them. But what's the evidence that they won't? That is our question tonight. And to discuss all that and more, I'm joined by a panel of 4. Tom Tugendhat MP, he's chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee. Dan Hannan is advisor to the UK Board of Trade, founding president of the Initiative for Free Trade. He's now a member of the House of Lords, taking the Tory whip. Maya Lester, QC, is a barrister at Brick Court Chambers, and Tom Burgis is the investigations correspondent for the Financial Times. He's just produced a book, let me show you, Kleptopia by Tom Burgis. It's a racing read. It's not what you would really expect from the Financial Times. It's full of great storytelling and great insight. How dirty money is conquering the world. That's our panel. If we were in a proper meeting rather than a virtual one, I'd ask you to give them a round of applause. But instead, I'll move on and say we're going to hear opening remarks from our speakers, about 5 minutes each. We'll keep it quite tight. Then we're going to have some questions to them from me, facilitate a 30-minute discussion, and then we'll open the panel to questions from you, our audience. We have a very big audience tonight, so we're going to leave plenty of time for you to ask these questions. If you want to ask one, please write it in the text box or email events@spectator.co.uk. That's events@spectator.co.uk. Shorter questions, rather than essays, are more likely to be used. Now, a very special thanks to the Initiative for Free Trade, the IFT. It's a research organization which works to educate civil society about the economics of trade liberalization. It's sponsoring today's event. Let's kick off. Let's go first to Tom Tugendhat. Tom.
Andrew, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be in the Spectator offices for the first time in a while. This question about economic warfare is one that has been raised many times before, and the range of which it applies has always been pretty great, from encircling cities to sowing Carthage with salt, as Scipio Africanus taught us. The way in which economics are being used as a way of controlling an enemy or indeed shaping an action is not new. What has changed is the way in which this has become more targeted. In the early days of economic pressure, even really up until only a few decades ago, the only way in which a government could be triggered, in which sanctions could be applied, was to push them onto an entire state, including, by definition, everybody within the boundaries of the nation. When you look, for example, at the tragedy that followed so many of the sanctions around Iraq in the 90s, you see a period in which the people of Iraq suffered more than their leadership, despite attempts, certainly, by the United Nations to make sure that they were targeting the leadership rather than the people. And in doing so, what we saw was actually that sanctions almost invariably failed. They made those who were sanctioning them be seen as the enemy, not in any way as a partner in the overthrow of a dictatorship. But now we're seeing something change. We're seeing a different way in which sanctions are being applied. In fact, going back to the idea of single combat between leaders, this is the first time that war has been personalized, perhaps for several hundred years. Because what we're seeing with sanctions, the latest of which are being called Magnitsky sanctions after, of course, Bill Browder's partner in Russian business who was murdered by the Putin regime. What we're seeing is sanctions targeted on individuals. We're seeing named people connected to human rights violations, connected to abuses of power, having their interests denied. The intention, of course, is pretty simple, that they won't be able to enjoy the fruits of their ill-gotten gains. They won't be able to shop at Harrods. They won't be able to walk in St. James's Park. They won't be able to take in the Champs-Élysées if they are sanctioned directly and personally. But are they really working? Well, we're going to find out. And the reason we're going to find out is because they're being rolled out even more frequently than they ever have before. We're seeing the numbers of sanctioned individuals rising. Only the other day, well, okay, a few months ago, we heard Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, saying that she didn't even have a bank account and she had to be paid in cash because of US sanctions. And after Dominic Raab's announcement in the House of Commons yesterday, we're presumably going to be seeing one or two officials who won't be able to send their children to English public schools or indeed to English or to UK universities. Perhaps we will see some of the red princes looking elsewhere. But we're really going to find out because actually it's not just us anymore who are using them. The reality is that the sanctions regime that we have used has become so popular that it is being used against us. If you look recently at the decisions by the Chinese Communist Party to sanction some individuals, you will see that the example that we have set is one that is being followed. Matt Pottinger, a good friend of mine who was the China director in the White House under the Trump administration, has now been sanctioned. John Bolton, the former national security advisor, Steve Bannon, and indeed their families and others are not only banned from traveling to China, but from doing business with China, and businesses that they advise or are connected to are also banned. And yesterday, or rather a few days ago, we saw sanctions applying to the EU, to the United Kingdom, and indeed to the US and Canada, as China acted to put sanctions on people like Mr. Butikofer and Ms. Lexman, both MEPs, and indeed to Dutch MPs, Belgian and Lithuanian MPs, and even a scholar in Adrian Zenz. So we're going to find out exactly how they work and what influence they have. But we're also going to find out what holes there are. Because the reality is that the nature of finance is changing. The nature of state influence is changing as electronic currencies and the different ways in which you can move money have evolved even in the last few years. So what does this mean for our sanctions? Well, the Venezuelans are already testing holes in the dollar sanctions. No doubt China using Alipay is going to be testing holes in the sanctions regimes in Southeast Asia, where it's beginning to roll out more successfully. And I'm sure others will be demonstrating that there are different ways around the dollar and the SWIFT system, and we will discover what they are. So I suspect, to briefly answer this question, we're going to find out really what the effect of sanctions are, and that they have so many holes. Their influence is limited, and what they really are is a better alternative to war in symbolic terms, even if not in real.
Tom, thank you very much. Tom Tugendhat there, kicking us off in this special Spectator TV on sanctions. Let's go now to Maya Lester, QC. Maya.
Well, to say that sanctions are in vogue at the moment is a serious understatement. Sanctions are now the tool of choice for every single foreign policy situation. You can see this just from a glance at the newspapers this week, and bearing in mind it's only Tuesday. So far, we've had the EU, the US, UK and Canada imposing targeted sanctions on China for its treatment of the Uyghurs, on Myanmar's military for its role in relation to the coup, and the EU on Eritrea's National Security Agency for human rights abuses in northern Ethiopia. We've got brand new human rights sanctions regimes in the UK and the EU, and a corruption regime, we are told, to come. So they are very much in vogue. Now, the most active of all sanctions imposers by far is the United States, What the US has done, and incredibly powerfully, is to use the dollar as a tool of economic warfare. It has harnessed the massive global power of the dollar. And what the US has basically said is, if you want to carry on using the dollar, you play by our rules. So the US sanctions not only US persons or people in its jurisdiction, but anyone in the world who does business with people that the US has sanctioned, these so-called secondary sanctions. And it has fined in billions of dollars for breach of sanctions, which no authority outside the US has ever done. So it's really US sanctions that determine the risk appetite of financial institutions and companies the world over. And although President Biden is reviewing US sanctions policy, it's certainly expected that all of that will continue. Now, the UK, as Tom Tugendhat has said, is very supportive of sanctions as well, both as a member of the European Union, where it was the most active on sanctions policy by a long margin, and now where since January, as a non-EU member state, the UK has been imposing its own sanctions. So why are sanctions so popular now and the go-to tool? Well, first of all, no one post-Iraq and Afghanistan has any appetite for a war or for invasion. And frankly, there aren't that many alternatives. Second, they look good. They send a very strong signal of disapproval. As the statement yesterday from the Foreign Secretary on China sanctions said, we will continue to stand together and shine a spotlight on China's human rights violations. So they show moral strength politically with the press and with campaign groups. They're also extremely easy to impose. It's normally just government action, executive action, with very, very little parliamentary oversight, legislative oversight. And outside the EU, we don't even need the agreement of any other member states. And the United Nations doesn't function much as a sanctioning body anymore, given the presence of China and Russia on the Security Council. The legal thresholds are incredibly low. So on the basis of, for example, an accusation in the press or in an NGO report, a mere suspicion that somebody is responsible for something or somebody said they were, is enough to see them on a sanctions list. And this isn't just state actors, it's non-state actors around the world. So the result is a mass of sanctions laws today, different laws from different jurisdictions, some inconsistent with each other, and some indeed trying to block the effects of each other. So do they work? Well, certainly it's very hard to argue with the noble aims that Tom Tugendhat outlined: countering human rights abuses, stopping corruption, stopping oppressive dictators. Who could argue with any of that? But I just want to suggest that there are a number of problems with the way sanctions are currently imposed and administered, which calls into question their effectiveness in really achieving any of this. There are three main problems. First, it seems to me, there is no clear thinking about what sanctions are actually supposed to achieve. What would working actually mean? What are they trying to do? How are they going to do it? And if they do achieve it, how are they going to be lifted? And often it's quite hard to see the strategy because it's never clearly articulated. Sanctions instruments say things like, in view of Russia's malign activities, in light of the deteriorating human rights situation in X country, we are imposing the following measures. So as Tom Tugendhat rightly said, targeted sanctions, that's lists of people and companies who are singled out for restrictions, are supposed to solve some of this problem. But I think they are just as problematic in terms of measuring what they're actually trying to do. Is this just signaling, or are they trying to change behavior? And if they are, how? The people you don't see on sanctions lists are, for example, President Putin or Mohammed bin Salman. So for those who are on the list, that's often people, business people, said to be connected with a regime. What is the theory here? How is that supposed to work? It's not actually analysed whether these people even have assets in the relevant jurisdiction, be that the EU or the UK, nor whether relevantly any pressure that they feel is actually going to have the slightest impact on those who are in fact responsible for the policies of the country in question, or indeed any articulated path towards lifting them. If you do X, you may see sanctions on you lifted. That's something the US has done, but we have certainly not done that, and nor has the EU. Secondly, there seems to me no clear thinking about what they are to be used for. So sanctions traditionally are a foreign policy instrument. But because I would suggest they're so easy to use, they are now used every day for things that have nothing to do with foreign policy: corruption, violations of human rights, narcotics trafficking, noble aims. But why are sanctions the appropriate tool? Where there's a UK connection, and we're talking about money laundering in the United Kingdom, there are perfectly good law enforcement mechanisms, perhaps not actively used, but they should be, it seems to me. And where they are used, there is due process, there is a system of investigation and prosecution. Secondly, how do asset freezing lists stop that kind of bad behavior? Certainly we feel good about ourselves because of the signaling effect, but what good is it actually going to do? And thirdly, it seems to me there's very little analysis of the true cost of sanctions and whether the supposed benefits outweigh them. First, the cost to civilian populations. Yes, it's true, we don't do full trade boycotts anymore, but you try telling the people of Iran, Syria, or North Korea at the moment, where there are incredibly far-reaching sanctions regimes, that they don't impose suffering on the civilian populations. They plainly do. Again, never very analysed. Second, the cost of complying with sanctions. The mass of different laws I have outlined might make interesting work for the likes of me, but it's hugely costly for industry to comply with them. And often the risks are so great, particularly when it comes to the eye-watering US fines, that banks and other companies quite sensibly take the view that they are simply too costly and they will over-comply. They will rule out particular countries as being out of risk appetite altogether, because frankly, it's so complicated to do anything else. Another difficulty and cost is that there isn't really a responsive agency who's actually there to grant exceptions to licenses, for example, to ensure that humanitarian aid gets where it needs to get. If you ask people in the charity sector, I suspect that they would more than support this. Third and finally, there is a real cost to the rule of law. Because these are not seen as criminal penalties, but as somehow preventative foreign policy tools, there is no presumption of innocence. There is no requirement of proof of these extremely serious allegations beyond, as I've said, a mere suspicion, which can often be based simply on press reports. And the consequences can be extremely severe for the individuals involved. The courts tend to be perhaps understandably deferential because this is seen to be foreign policy. And frankly, it doesn't seem to be a rule of law priority area for governments. And this seems to me a particular problem where we are preaching the rule of law around the world. So as Tom Tugendhat said, our example is being followed. And it seems to me, therefore, crucial that we set a good one. Thank you.
Maya Lessa, thank you for that. Let's go now to Dan Hannan.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Do sanctions actually work? It's a really underexplored question. I'm really grateful to Spectator TV for organising this debate. I'm really proud that IFT, my think tank, is involved with it. IFT basically exists to make the moral case for free trade as a poverty buster. But this question of sanctions is now, as Maya says, so widespread that we need to do some muscular thinking about the cost-benefit analysis. And there is very little of that. I've just come the short walk from Parliament here to the Spectator offices, having debated the genocide amendments to the trade bill. And in both chambers, I think it's fair to say that the focus was on regimes of which people disapproved and how much they disapproved of them, rather than on the effectiveness or otherwise of specific measures. And I suppose that's an inescapable side of human nature. You know, it's much easier, it's much more natural to respond to horrors than it is to enter into a quite technical discussion of the costs and benefits of particular sanctions. But let's ask the question, what can a country practically do if it is disapproving of policy in another country, or indeed if it concludes that crimes against humanity in extremis are taking place? Right? It's a question we should ask more often. You can imagine a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you could say there is an absolute moral obligation, always and everywhere, to intervene against genocide, whatever the cost. So we will get together an international coalition if we can, and we will send troops into Xinjiang or Arakan or whatever the disputed area is. We will seek to overthrow the Venezuelan government or be defeated in the attempt, right? That would be the one extreme of the spectrum. The other extreme of the spectrum would be to say, you know what, there's really not much we can do. We'll support a condemnatory resolution in the UN. We might tick off an ambassador. We might welcome some refugees, but there's not really anything practically we can do. Now, the question that we need to face, that every democracy should be asking itself if it wants to be interested and engaged in international affairs, is where is the optimum point on that spectrum? Where is the point on that line where, in a practical and achievable way, you are most likely to effect policy change in another country? And here is one thing that I can say with absolute certainty. Generalized trade sanctions are not the answer. They are not on that spectrum at all. They're not just useless, they do more harm than good. They hurt all the wrong people. They hurt ordinary folk in the other country and in your own country. And if anything, they prop up the regime of which you disapprove and drive support for the dictators and the autocrats. Now, Maya put it very well. She said, we often adopt these measures because it sounds good, right? It's the most dangerous, albeit sadly, a widespread sequence in politics. Something must be done. Oh, there's something, let's do that. And you can see that sequence has led country after country into policy cul-de-sacs from which they then find it hard to back out. But the reality is that imposing sanctions, especially the kind of general sanctions which, as Maya says, are felt by people at large in Iran or North Korea or whatever, are a blessing for the authoritarian regimes that run those places. They drive the kind of patriotic angst in a population, the sense of siege that pushes people to support the incumbent. I remember Jose Maria Aznar, the Spanish leader, telling me once that he had said to Castro, to Fidel Castro, the late Fidel Castro, without the US blockade, your regime would have fallen at the same time that all of the other communist regimes fell in 1989, 1990. And as Aznar tells the story, Castro said, yep, you know, that's a pretty fair analysis. Now, the truth is that Cubans are poor because of a rotten economic system. We know that. We've seen that it's a rotten system wherever it's applied in the world. But the embargo gave the Castro clique the excuse, the alibi they needed. The reason you are suffering all this squalor, all this wretchedness, is not because Marxism is a bad economic model, but because of the terrible Yankee blockade. And that commensurate sense of being under siege kept communism going in Cuba for a generation after it had fallen elsewhere. By the way, I think Vladimir Putin is well aware of that psychology. My guess is that the reason that he keeps provoking quarrels with the West, the reason he keeps getting into fights and almost inviting economic sanctions, is not because he desperately wants to occupy a slice of Georgia or whatever it is. It's because keeping the Russian people in that state of anxiety, of wounded patriotism, of literally siege mentality, is exactly the condition that will make them most likely to support a regime like his. And of course, even a dictator needs some measure of genuine support in the population. In extremis, you have a situation like that in Iraq in the 90s, where in fact the sanctions, for all of the attempts of the people imposing them to target them at people that they didn't like, ended up falling hardest on ordinary Iraqis, but enriching cronies of the regime and their allies abroad through the oil for food boondoggles and associated schemes that allowed politically connected individuals to do well. In fact, when a country is sanctioned, it kind of joins a club with Cuba and Russia and so on. They kind of get together, and individuals within those countries are then able to exploit opportunities that are created, that are always created when you narrow a market. Right? The one way of allowing people to get very rich is to create an artificial monopoly, and trade sanctions that have that effect are no different from any other kind of monopoly. If all of this sounds a little bit distant, let me, in a very mild form, ask the many people who are watching tonight what their immediate reaction was when they heard that the UK might be the target of a specific and targeted export ban from the European Union. My general supposition is that most people will have responded, whether they voted Remain or Leave, wherever they stood, with a feeling of wounded patriotism and some annoyance at the other country for being provocative in this way. Why assume that Iranians or Venezuelans or Cubans feel any differently? So, if not general sanctions, what? Well, the one thing that I think the three of us who have so far spoken agree on is that it needs to be targeted, right? We need micro-targeted sanctions. But then there's another spectrum, right? If you're going down the Magnitsky route, or you're going down the route that Dominic Raab outlined with the first 4 officials to be targeted in China, what sanctions do you apply even at an individual level? And again, you have to imagine a spectrum there. Are we talking travel bans? Are we talking asset seizures? Are we talking international arrest warrants? Are we, at the extreme end of that line, talking about Eichmann-style judicial kidnappings that will allow people to be put on trial? We need to ask this question. What is it that people are most scared of? What is it that people really do not want to happen to them? And we then need to calibrate our policy accordingly. I think I've had my 5 minutes and I don't want to eat into any more time. So let me just finish with a general observation that when you are trying to reach particular individuals in key positions and to influence their behavior, so to arrange the incentives and disincentives around them that they will behave better, you need to be very smart. You need to use intelligence, you need to use eavesdropping, and you need to have a wide array of options open to you that will result in that behavioral change. The one thing which is absolutely clear is that we need to approach this issue as keyhole surgery rather than hacking blindly around us with a cleaver.
Okay, Dan Hannan, thank you very much. Let's go now to Tom Burgis. Tom.
Thanks, Andrew. Absolute delight to be with you all. If you don't mind, I'm just going to discard my notes actually and pick up on something that Maya said, which I thought was so important, that we use sanctions when we should be using the law. And if I may, I'll just give you a story quickly of 2 billionaires that I've covered and chased around various hot parts of the world. One called Benny Steinmetz and one called Dan Gertler. Benny Steinmetz, Franco-Israeli, he got hold of an enormous iron ore deposit in Guinea in West Africa. And in doing so, it's now been found, he paid some bribes, and he engaged in the corruption that has been so ruinous in West Africa. Now, about 7 years later, he's been convicted in Switzerland on corruption charges, and it's been the most enormous international law enforcement effort. Israeli law enforcement, Swiss, and the Americans chiefly, working in extraordinarily imaginative ways. There was a wiretap in a Florida airport, and so on. And after 7 or so years, the rule of law prevailed, and Steinmetz has been convicted. Now, whether he actually goes to jail, he's appealing. He's always denied wrongdoing. Nonetheless, that is clearly a victory for the rule of law. Now, the other billionaire is Dan Gertler, who operates a little bit to the south in Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the most naturally rich but utterly benighted places you could ever set foot. Gertler has had a long presence there, going back to the terrible war in the 90s, and he's become very, very close to the dictator Joseph Kabila. And Gertler was eventually put under Magnitsky sanctions by the US. So not a law enforcement move, a sanctions move. Tom Tugendhat mentioned earlier the Magnitsky sanctions, and we can, of course, talk more about those. But Gertler, although he's popped up in various legal cases, and he too says that he's never done anything wrong, he was put under sanctions for the corruption he was accused of being a part of. Now, one of the last things that the Trump administration did was quietly, silently, in fact, to rescind essentially the sanctions imposed on Gertler after some lobbying by or some representations made by Alan Dershowitz and reportedly by Mossad. And there you have the difference between the rule of law and the sanctions regime. that Steinmetz is convicted through a legal process, and he will have to go back to court to try to fight that. Gertler was subject to sanctions, and he can use some of his wealth to try to influence the process and in secret have them released. And I think this is the central danger of sanctions, because for me, the context in which we must understand them is what's going on in the world at the moment, which is an undeclared, unconventional war between states governed by the rule of law and aggressive, expansionist, authoritarian kleptocracies that Tom Tugendhat and others have done so well to try to call out, led by Russia and China. And I think the reason we turn to sanctions, or one reason we turn to sanctions, be interested to hear what Maya thinks about this, is that we have so dramatically underfunded our law enforcement. Sanctions are the easy, cheap option because the Serious Fraud Office is spectacularly underfunded to the point that it's trying to take on oligarchs who make its annual budget in a fortnight. Last year, the NCA, the National Crime Agency, received 570,000 suspicious activity reports from banks, which tells you two things. One, how on earth is the team of 20 or so dealing with that supposed to actually enforce any sanctions or any other part of the financial regime? And the other part it tells you is that banks became aware of 500,000 suspicious activities or suspicious transactions and went ahead with them. And I just make one more point, if I may, for now, which is that if sanctions are one tool in a war, in the new war between the rule of law states and authoritarian kleptocracies, then I feel we should be paying much more attention to what's going on behind our own lines. The kleptocracies that are being targeted by sanctions, if they want to turn their illegitimate power, turn their raw autocratic power into something much more special, into legitimized power, into statesmanship, what do? Where do they come? They come to London. Where do they get their private spies to chase down their dissidents and to manipulate Western law enforcement agencies? They get them in Mayfair. Who do they turn to when, let's say, Nursultan Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan, when his security forces massacre protesters in Zhanaozen? Who does he get to help draft his speech to gloss over the whole thing? He gets Tony Blair. Where do people with long careers connected to Russian intelligence come to turn a little bit of their fortunes into political influence? The Conservative Party. The list is long, and I fear that we won't understand sanctions or how they could be used today unless we look at this whole picture of this fundamental struggle really to preserve democracies.
Tom Burgis, thank you for that. Let me come to Tom Tugendhat and ask this question. You say, Tom, that we don't know that sanctions are working, but they are being rolled out ever more frequently. Would it not make sense to try and establish if they're working before we roll out any more?
Perhaps I should have used the term working slightly differently. We certainly know they work in terms of signalling. They work at home in the sense that they allow a minister to demonstrate action. Whether or not it is action is not entirely the point. So in that sense, they do work. Where they may or may not work is whether or not they change behavior. And this is as yet unclear. And the reason it's unclear is because we don't know whether the son or daughter of an oligarch from whichever state they may be, would otherwise have sought advantage in the educational establishments of Germany or France or the UK, but sanctions stopped them. We don't know if that threat actually dissuaded the oligarch or whoever it may have been, the official, from certain behavior. Now, the reason we don't know is because it's very difficult to prove a negative. But it does allow, what they do allow, and I say this with very caveated enthusiasm, they do allow governments to conduct actions that make them feel like they're acting short of actually conducting military action. And frankly, that's not nothing. You know, the idea that governments don't feel the obligation to bomb something, I think is a positive. So it's not all negative just because it's not immediately obvious that what is happening isn't enormous.
Maya Lester, the problem I have is that I can see how if you target individuals with sanctions or individual entities with sanctions, that you can hurt them. It's possible. Some, I suppose, have been hurt by sanctions. But it doesn't change the way the state that they come from behaves, does it? I mean, targeting individuals may be nice to do, and it may be the only thing you can do, but it doesn't change the state policy that you object to, or does it?
Well, I think potentially it could, but there are a number of obstacles. One is very often, as I've said, the leaders and decision makers responsible for policy are not those on the sanctions list, no doubt for reasons of high politics. But if you don't sanction the decision makers, it won't be that surprising if the decision makers don't change their behavior. Secondly, I think this is quite a subtle and difficult question because it very much depends on what is happening in that country, the dynamics there, who holds the power, where are the pressure points, are the leaders susceptible if the so-called oligarchs were in fact sanctioned in Russia. So if we listen to Navalny's call for those with the serious money, the oligarchs around Putin, to be sanctioned, would that be enough? Would that start to impose real pressure on him to change his policies in relation to Ukraine? Maybe. Now, I'm no policy expert, but my point is before you start drawing up lists of individuals, an easy and strong signaling thing to do, this must be something that should be studied. What is the strategy? So is this a country where a dictator is embedded and is simply going to enrich themselves, find different routes to trade, and avoid any pressure, put up with his people starving or her people starving, no problem? Or is it a jurisdiction where actually there are people who may complain loudly enough that you see some movement? And I think it is often said, possibly with some force, that, for example, sanctions, including targeted sanctions, may have led Iran to the negotiating table when it came to the nuclear deal. Now, those sanctions were, of course, not just targeted sanctions on individuals, although there were lots of those. They were very far-reaching. So I think a second answer to your question is, it may be true that targeted sanctions may sometimes not be enough, but as soon as you go to broader measures, then of course you have the broader impact on the economy and on the population that has been identified. But there are lots of studies of the impact of targeted sanctions. You see very detailed, almost econometric tables drawing up who's been targeted on different sanctions regimes, what might be the aim be, and when are they effective. The difficulty is because the aims are never articulated, we never know what they mean by effective, but you get wonderfully specific percentages ranging from 3% of the time to 51% of the time they have some impact. My point is not so much that targeted sanctions don't work or can't work, but there is no strategy set out for how it is they're supposed to work, and also crucially how it is that they're to be lifted. Now, the US does a pretty good job, it seems to me, where we don't, of engaging with people on the sanctions list, and they are wildly better resourced than any sanctions agency around the world in the US, but they will directly engage and they will say, the aim of sanctions is to change behavior. If you, people on the sanctions list, come to us and show us changed behavior, whoever you are, we will engage with you. We will tell you whether what you've done is enough or not enough. And if it's enough, sanctions will be lifted. Now, that is crucially important if you're engaging, it seems to me, in targeted sanctions, because if decision makers are serious that their purpose is to create a behavior change, whether that is denouncing a regime, as has happened with Venezuela, US sanctions, or some other shift in behavior, design a perfect corruption compliance program and come and show us that you mean it, there has to be an agency resourced enough and engaging enough with the individuals to say, no, that's not enough, or yes, that's enough. And that seems to me to be a decent stab at making them work.
Dan Hannan, aren't you tilting at windmills by attacking the generalized economic sanctions of the kind that were implemented way back in 1960 against Cuba or against Iraq in the 1990s? Because that is not really the kind of sanction that governments are deploying in 2021. We've moved on from there.
I wish that were true, but I'm afraid it isn't. The amendment to the trade bill currently before Parliament says if there is a determination of gross human rights abuses in another country with whom we have a trade deal, the trade deal should automatically lapse. Now, not having a trade deal is, if you like, the softest kind of economic sanction, but it is general. It is a generalized sanction against the whole country. It isn't targeted at individuals. And I have to say that the debate both inside and outside Parliament is still very much along those lines. So people will say things like, well, if we're having sanctions against China or Cuba, then why don't we have sanctions against Saudi Arabia or Israel, or they fill in their particular hobby horse. And the unquestioned assumption, I think, animating a lot of this public discourse is that sanctions are effective and that restricting trade is a way of hurting other people. And of course, I think, as all of us on this panel agree, it hurts the wrong people, and it also hurts ourselves. But this is a vitally important discussion to be having in an age where increasingly there is a reluctance to see the benefit of unrestricted commerce. And I don't just mean that there is a general protectionist mood, although there is coming out of the epidemic and the lockdowns. We see it in the US, we see it in Brussels, we see it in China. There is I'm afraid, as always happens when there is one of these events, people get thrown back on some rather primal instincts and they become more protectionist, more inward looking. There's suddenly a great vogue for self-sufficiency and all the rest of it. But even setting aside the economics, if you were to plot a graph where you looked at the nastiest regimes with the worst human rights abuses, and you were to correlate that on the other axis with the countries that are most integrated into the global trading system, you would see a fairly strong correlation between autarky and autocracy. You'd see that, as it were, at one end you have the North Koreas, and at the other end you have the New Zealands. Now, of course, it's not a perfect correlation. Of course, we have exceptions. But as a general rule, encouraging market norms, encouraging the spread of secure property rights, arbitrated by some kind of independent magistracy, is a way of leading countries away from authoritarian government. So anything that, if you like, reverses that direction, that pushes them back towards a more controlled economy, is, in the most direct sense, self-defeating. And we should be very careful, I would say, of legislation designed to send a message. It's the curse of our age, whether it's trade sanctions or hate speech bills, or as soon as you hear a legislator standing up and saying, we need to send a message, almost guaranteed you are going to have disproportionate unintended consequences, because performative legislation is bad legislation.
But should we be doing free trade deals with the totalitarian states?
Yes, it will make them less totalitarian over time.
What's the evidence for that?
Well, as I say, if you correlate the countries which are the most economically controlled with the ones which are the most politically backwards, it's not an exact correlation, but there is a pretty strong one. But if you want to spread the kind of assumptions that underpin liberal democracy, then spreading property rights and consumer choice is a good way of doing it. Because once people get into the habit of saying, I can choose my mobile phone operator, I can choose my make of car, I can choose whatever branded clothes, it becomes much more anomalous that they can't choose who their mayor is or their regional governor. And so you create...
But where is the evidence for that? I mean, China hasn't got a free trade deal with the EU or with America, but it sure trades a hell of a lot with both. I mean, billions and billions of dollars worth of trade. And it's grown exponentially since the year 2000, since it got into the WTO. China's become more brutal, more repressive with more trade, not less.
Yeah, I mean, China is always held up as the one counterexample, and it shouldn't be the only country that we look at here.
Well, Saudi Arabia, I'll give you another one, Saudi Arabia.
Well, I'm not sure that you could argue. I mean, I'm really no fan of Saudi Arabia, and I think we are altogether far too soft on Saudi Arabia. But I don't think you could argue that Saudi Arabia is currently becoming more repressive than it was 5 or 10 years ago.
Oh, I think you can. It's an area of the world I know quite a lot about. MBS has turned an oligarchy, which is how Saudi Arabia was run, basically into a dictatorship of one man.
Yeah, I mean, look,
Much more repressive.
if you want to if you want to make the case that MBS is a very bad thing, you'll get no argument from me. The way in which he managed to convince an awful lot of Westerners by pressing buttons on women's rights and Israel and so on to overlook his abuses was extraordinary. But on the, if you take a like with like comparison in South American countries, in African countries, in Asian countries, and you say which are the ones that are opening most, allowing foreign investment, allowing, joining the WTO, allowing norms of property to become embedded. By and large, it's not a perfect system. I'm not saying I'm not saying this is a magic wand that makes them democracies, but by and large, it helps.
Okay, and let me ask Tom Tugendhat the same thing. Should we be seeking? I mean, there are so many countries with whom we don't have free trade deals. Most of the ASEAN members, we don't. Australia, we don't. Canada, we don't. The United States, we don't. Should we not be concentrating on doing free trade deals with them rather than with dictatorships?
Yes, we should. And I buy Dan's line that there isn't a perfect correlation, but by and large, these things are lying, at least they used to. But I have to say, I think the change in this correlation, as it were, is China. Correlation is not causation. And the reality is what we've seen in China in recent years is a great increase in individual wealth, in different forms of self-determination in various different ways, in economic sense anyway, and yet an increasingly autocratic government. Now, perhaps this is, the supernova that's shining brightest before the dark, but at the moment, the regime of General Secretary Xi is clamping down on individual freedoms at the same time as economic freedom seems to be growing. Now, let's see what that means. But as far as free trade deals, let's look at where we can actually develop partnerships, because free trade deals, if they are going to serve both parties, need to be based on principles that both parties can agree on, broadly speaking, predictable outcomes, which we call the rule of law. After all, the rule of law is not something magical. It's just a way of trying to predict the future through certain organized algorithmic encounters. Now, that we should do with countries that least are likely to follow the procedural elements that we put in place. So I think that as much as possible, we should invest in free trade deals with countries that are similarly minded, and perhaps at the very broadest level have the sort of WTO, the absolutely lowest possible standard of openness with those we don't.
Tom Burgis, let me come back to you, because it seems to me that when governments introduce sanctions against individuals, oligarchs, people who may have had ill-gotten gains, and then kind of use London to money launder the money in to try and make it, quote, respectable. When governments do that, are they trying to get these individuals? Or surely it's a foreign policy initiative which they're trying to get the regimes that these individuals represent to change their ways. And in fact, they don't change their ways. You may upset the individuals, you may even get the individuals, you may get an unexplained wealth order and so on. But state policy doesn't change, does it?
Well, I think it's a crucial question, that. And I think it goes to the heart of this, which is, for me, we mistake essentially organized crime gangs that have taken over nation states for those nation states. So I think the discussion about sanctions has gone a long way from the idea of changing foreign policy. I think the idea that we apply these sanctions in order to shift, let's say, Putin's foreign policy would be naive and mistaken, because to my mind, Putin's main reason for capturing and maintaining power is self-enrichment and the enrichment of the cabal around him and the projection of that power through that corrupt wealth. And therefore, I think that brings me to a point that's, I think, in defense of sanctions, maybe, which is that what we're trying to do is make it difficult to be ultra corrupt and to weaponize that corrupt money and shift it into the West. And that means simply making it difficult for the rulers of these kleptocracies to use the banking system. And that's something sanctions do. they make it more difficult, more awkward to shift your money through the banking system. It's a game of whack-a-mole, right? Where we might name a handful of entities with funny names in funny places controlled by oligarchs, but there will be, for every one we find, there'll be a dozen we know. So we're constantly in this game of trying to catch the spot the conduits by which this corrupt money moves out into the rule of law states. But I'd just say lastly that there are, as we've been saying throughout, massive problems with the use of sanctions. But I had two conversations recently, one with an incredibly brave journalist. She works in eastern Ukraine. You can imagine what it's like trying to turn to report there, on especially on Russian interests. And on the other hand, I had another quiet conversation in London with an MI6 veteran who'd done a lot of work in Russia and China. And I put this essentially sort of part of the case we're all making to these two people, and I said, look, sanctions can be we use them when we should concentrate on well-resourced law enforcement. They can be manipulated by kleptocrats to take down their own enemies, and all the problems we've been listing. And the journalist in eastern Ukraine said, we don't have time to wait for the 7-year law enforcement case against some oligarch who's doing Putin's bidding in eastern Ukraine. We're essentially under occupation now. We need anything you can do to block the money flows. And the MI6 chap, his argument was very simple. He said, we are wide open to the malign influence of these authoritarian kleptocracies. And if all you've got is a blunderbuss, by which he meant sanctions, if all you've got is a blunderbuss, then use a blunderbuss.
Tom Tugendhat says that well-heeled lawyers and slick accountants are taking eye-watering fees from oligarchs to help get them off these blacklists. Is he talking about you?
I wish. He's not talking about me, and for the reason that if you want to represent somebody who's on one of these lists, you need to get a license because their funds are frozen. And if you get a license, the amount of fees that are charged will be subject to incredible scrutiny by the authorities in the UK, at least. And so the fees are set at such a level that actually the opposite problem is true. There are many law firms who will never be able to represent people on these lists because of the levels of fee that they're able to charge, but also because I'm sorry to say that the agencies responsible for granting licenses take so long to do so that by the time those legal licenses are granted, it's simply too late for the firm to be able to represent someone. There's another problem, which is that in the US, for lawyers who wish to represent those on sanctions lists, their law firms very often don't enable them to do so, don't permit them to be able to do so because of the reputational risks. So actually, I think there is a real problem of access to justice, given how incredibly low the evidential thresholds are for getting people onto sanctions lists. And given that I have seen a number of cases, not only where it seems that the evidence is very thin or even unjustified, but where there are cases of mistaken identity, where there are simply the wrong people on the lists, it's absolutely crucial to the credibility of these regimes that they sort out the proper means of legal representation in a fair way. So if you are going to engage in the business of naming people and shaming them, that you at least permit them the dignity of being able to defend themselves properly.
And Tom Tugendhat, isn't that a point? The point Maya made earlier was that the government can put you on a blacklist. There's no appeal. There's no real due process. The government just designates you on a blacklist, and certain sanctions will follow. Now, in a number of cases, you may have got the bad guys. They all do seem to be largely guys, and so a kind of justice is done if these people then suffer by having their wealth or some of it frozen. But it isn't due process, is it? It's not a proper rule of law. It's ruled by government fiat.
You're absolutely right. And actually, our reference to lawyers and accountants was actually in relation to money laundering, and that's in our Moscow's Gold Report of May 2018, not so much to do with sanctions, but to do with the illegal movement of funds around the world. And you're absolutely right. There is a big difference here. And we're talking actually about two different things. And I think it's worth being clear. There is a difference between the aspects that Tom and Maya have spoken about, which are absolutely rule of law issues. They're to do with corruption. They're to do with protecting ourselves from dirty money, for example, and corruption that may flow into the UK through various different avenues. And then there's foreign policy. And the two are not the same. So when you talk about having government by fiat in terms of rule of law, you're absolutely right. This is a challenge that we really need to look at very seriously, because if we're simply sanctioning individuals because of their connection to others, or because of the corruption that they may be connected with, that is a rule of law issue. If, however, what we're doing is we're sanctioning individuals because we believe that the money that they're using is being used to, for example, undermine the integrity of the state, to corrupt state officials, and directly as a national security threat, then that is a different requirement, in the same way as the military and diplomacy comes under a different legal system in many ways. I wouldn't overstate this, but in some ways than contract law. And actually, for much of what we're talking about, the real effect, the best effect, is actually not sanctions. The reality is sanctions on Vladimir Putin are going to make no difference at all. He's a man who's somehow or other collected north of 200 billion US dollars in various different ways, and is probably the richest person in the entire world. The real way in which to expose that is to start to highlight exactly where those accounts are, to highlight the different jurisdiction in which the money is hidden, and make sure that somebody like Tom Burgis writes a book, and then we give him protection because he'd need it, but writes a book that would highlight every single aspect of the money that he's stolen off the Russian people and many, many others around the world. Because sanctions on somebody like him don't really make a difference.
I want to come to Tom and then to Dan, and then I'm going to take some questions from the audience, kicking off with a politician from Venezuela who sent in a question. So, Tom, let me come to you first. London has built up this reputation, not in a good way, over recent years of being a sort of laundromat for dirty money. And we've seen it pour into the property market and even into the public schools. And I hear stories of people turning up with cash to pay these massive overpriced school fees that people think they have to pay. It also puzzles me, as someone who's just been opening a bank account, and the amount of due diligence I have to go through to get it, proof where I've lived for years, passport notarized, and birth certificate, all the rest of it, how these people can get away with it. But that's another point, when it's so difficult for me just to open a bank account as someone who's kind of reasonably well known as not a money launderer. But because London has become so dependent on this kind of economy, I think the New York Times at one stage said about 90 billion pounds in cash have been spent in London in 1 year. To what extent are we really out to stop this, or actually do we make a few token efforts, but overall we quite like seeing all this money come into our capital city?
Yeah, it's a crucial question. I mean, there was that, for me, defining moment in first half of 2013, shortly after the annexation of Crimea, when a well-placed photographer on Downing Street got a snap of the briefing notes going into the National Security Council, the gist of which was, okay, we should impose some sort of sanction on Russia for the land grab in Crimea, but whatever we do, we mustn't interfere with the interests of the city. And that's the fundamental problem. So, for instance, when the US has its huge tax clampdowns, yeah, it goes after UBS and Credit Suisse, the big Swiss banks, for helping Americans avoid taxes. You can see there's obviously a kind of direct interest for the US Treasury, right? That's its money being squirreled away. The UK is in a very different position, where it is this kind of entrepot, right, for corrupt money from all over the world. Tom Tugendhat and others have done a great job of demonstrating this. Before we started, I went back to the stats on global sanctions put together by this great think tank in the US called C4ADS. It basically works out where all the sanctioned entities in the world are, right? This is UN, US, and EU sanctions. And Iran is way ahead, and then Russia and Syria are very high. But then you come to Congo 118, Venezuela 184, and just 2 behind Venezuela is the UK with 182. And I think we, as you say, we often forget that kleptocracy is essentially transnational, right? This corruption that we're talking about, it's not linked to states. Sure, dictators have to capture state resources. They have to be able to control the allocation of state contracts, the allocation of oil and mining licenses, and they have to be able to sign arms deals. But their actual wealth is generally here. And that is the core of our problem you've hit on there, which is, do we see dirty money essentially as an investment for which we want to hold our nose, or do we see it, as I think we should, as a fundamental threat to democracy? And that really is the decision between those two positions, I think, is at the heart of this idea of global Britain and what a post-Brexit Britain is going to be.
Dan, let me come to you on this. Is this good news or bad news? In recent years, we have taken some targeted sanctions against individual Russians close to the Kremlin or oligarchs whose gains we fear may be ill-gotten. And we've done that on a number of occasions, particularly after the chemical attack in Salisbury. But at the same time, in the past 5 years, our trade with Russia has grown rather quickly. I was quite surprised at the figures. We imported £6 billion worth from Russia in 2015. It's now over £10 billion we've done. Is that good or bad?
It's good news because it's ordinary people in both countries doing better. And we have to be absolutely rigorous about saying we will deploy against Russian individuals or the Russian state things that are effective, things that will change behavior or will be regarded as deterrents by the bad guys, not things that will look good in tomorrow's headlines. So there's no question that the Russian state in Salisbury, for the second time, murdered somebody living under the Queen's peace. That is, by some definitions, an act of war. It plainly invited a response. The easy thing for any minister in that situation is to say, oh, here's something, let's impose some sanctions, and to a degree that happened. But of course, it's been ineffective. I wonder whether the better solution isn't what Tom Tugendhat was just suggesting. The Russian state in many ways is a slightly sort of ramshackle entity, kind of lolloping about like an alcoholic bear. But one thing that it's brilliant at is integrating diplomacy, soft power, cyber warfare, and, when necessary, hard ballistic power. And we have been left standing in that field. We've really not engaged with anything like the determination that some hostile regimes have. And I wonder whether the UK now needs to be looking very hard at the kind of our equivalent of Russia's desinformatia campaigns. We know that one thing that is regarded as a deterrent by Putin and Putinites is having their wealth revealed, right? That was one of the sins that landed Navalny in prison. It's why they hate people like Tom writing books about them. If that's information that can be intelligently disseminated, that is something that they definitely don't like. And the same is true for some of the individuals in other nasty regimes. I'd make one final point, and it's again to agree with Tom. While doing this, we should, in parallel, be moving towards a much more open, liberal trading order with the world at large, including with some of our closest friends. It's extraordinary that as EU members, we were never able to have free trade agreements with Australia, New Zealand, the United States. Those have to be priorities for us now. And in pursuit of them, we need to be prepared to be comprehensive and ambitious, right? This is not a time for us to say, oh, well, we're all in favor of trade, but we're going to start prioritizing a bunch of unrelated issues of, food miles or animal welfare or labor rights. Those are all important questions, but they don't belong in a trade deal. We have to be a country that is leading the effort to restart a stalled global trading system as we come out of these lockdown recessions.
And I learned today that you've done the Initiative for Free Trade has announced an association with the University of Buckingham to contribute to the teaching and research on trade policy.
Well, somebody has to teach trade policy from a free market point of view. It's a surprisingly big niche. Or an awful lot of academic trade is taught by people who want to talk about everything except the trade. They want to talk about protection of rare species or women's rights or whatever. But trade is actually a separate subject from those things.
It shouldn't take too long to teach them that, Dan. All they have to do is start with Adam Smith and then move to Ricardo, and it's pretty much job done. Let me bring in some questions now from our audience. I'm going to put two together because they overlap. Professor Tim Evans has a very clear question, which is, what do you make of recent reports concerning the illicit trade involving gold and oil between Venezuela and the UAE, that's the United Arab Emirates on the Gulf? And I link that with a question that we've had from Julio Borges, who is a Venezuelan opposition politician. He's co-founder of the Justice First political party. He says, as an opposition politician in Venezuela, we're a country living under sanctions. I've watched a regime impoverish their people, abuse the most basic human rights, but they continue to live lavishly as a result of sophisticated sanctions busting, with the help of a number of regimes who are set to undermine humanitarian values and the rule-based order. Current regime in Venezuela smuggles our national gold reserves out in return for cash and refined oil products. And he talks about a Reuters report. I assume Professor Evans is doing the same thing. Russia moves out Venezuelan gold reserves. Iran provides gasoline, additives as well, and the UAE provides cash for the gold. Pretty complicated, Tom Tugendhat, but it shows you how you can get around these sanctions if you've got state actors in particular willing to get around them. And I would point out that the UAE is meant to be one of our most important allies in the Gulf.
Well, it's certainly true that state actors can get around pretty much anything. The best dodgy dollar notes are printed by North Korea. And so there are a whole series of different ways in which state actors are fraudulently undermining different procedures. So, all I can say is yes. The reality, however, is that there are actions, the actions against these things are very difficult short of war. And so the reality is, if you want to stop them, the only way realistically to do them is to expose them. Now, we run very advanced forms of intelligence gathering networks, and we are able in various different ways to know who is doing what to whom and when. And this is where my faith in the sanctions regime is not always that high, but my faith in social pressure, peer pressure, after all, we are social animals, is rather higher. Being exposed as somebody who's willing to watch the destruction of Venezuela, or willing to enrich themselves on the death of Russian children, or whatever it happens to be this time, is, I think, a greater deterrent to most people than the possibility that you may not be able to shop in Harrods for a few months.
Let me go to Henry. He doesn't give us his surname, but he asks, what oversight for sanction implementation exists that prevents economic warfare escalating into war? Maya, I guess there's really nothing that could stop that happening, but it tends not to happen in the modern world. Is that right?
Well, I think that's right. So economic sanctions traditionally were accompaniments to war. And it's only relatively recently a 20th century invention that they are used in peacetime as an alternative to war. But obviously, Iraq is a case in point where sort of sanctions are tried and warfare may follow. And there's certainly nothing stopping that. That's a pure matter of policy. Just one comment on the last question. There's certainly Reuters reports to the effect of sanctions evasion in relation to Venezuela. But here's where my point is absolutely crucial about proper enforcement of sanctions. So part of do global sanctions work is anyone policing whether they are working or being avoided? And here again, the US is the world leader. There are every day reports of criminal prosecutions and settlements reached for people said to be evading US sanctions. That's not been a feature of EU or so far UK sanctions very much, but we'll see. But that's the stick element of imposing fines and criminal prosecutions for breach is, of course, one element that's really important to the efficacy of sanctions.
Tom Burgis, it seems that America, the EU, the United Kingdom, we're prepared to hurt, but not necessarily to wound very deeply. So we go for some of the oligarchs in Russia. We've gone this week for some high-profile people in China. But of course, we don't go for Mr. Putin. We don't go for President Xi in China. And here's if the UAE, I don't know, but if the UAE is guilty of trying to break the Venezuelan sanctions by helping with the gold purchases, well, of course, the UAE currency is pegged to the dollar, and it's entirely meshed in with the US banking system and dollar-denominated assets. But I suggest the Americans ain't going to go for the UAE's leadership either.
Yeah, I think there is this enormous difference. Maya's right to say the US has a sort of ferocious enforcement mechanism, vastly more effective than anyone else. But there is this central contradiction that all these sanctions are ultimately political decisions, and they're not law enforcement tools, and so they don't come with prosecutorial decisions. These are not career prosecutors of the Department of Justice or the Swedish Fraud Office or whatever deciding that there's a case to be brought and pursuing it with all their vigor. And I guess there's also, again, this conflation of gangsters and presidents, right? Putin is at once the president of a state that's a member of the United Nations and the leader of a kind of gangster cabal. And the sanctions deal with one, and on the other hand, we have to deal with him, deal with his office. I'd add one other point on this. It's linked to the Venezuela question as well, which is, look at that list of countries that are suspected. They're named in the Reuters reports. There's been other investigations, some evidence that I've seen that does seem to flesh out these smuggling routes, these sanctions busting routes of Venezuelan gold, especially through Western Central Africa and into Abu Dhabi, and abetted by Russians, and perhaps in exchange for petroleum products from Iran. Look at that list, and then, if I may, I'll just read you this quote that Sergei Lavrov said yesterday in China. He said, "We need to reduce sanctions risks by bolstering our technological independence." He's saying this standing next to his Chinese counterpart. "By switching to payments in our national currencies and global currencies that serve as an alternative to the dollar. We need to move away from using international payment systems controlled by the West." So by enforcing sanctions so zealously, which is obviously tempting, and there can be very good reasons to do that, you're in danger of creating a war on drugs problem, which is that you make the black market so huge that it becomes almost bigger than the licit market, and you create entire economies outside the rule of law.
Dan Hannan, Peter Keatley asks a question. He says, even if sanctions are not very effective, and we've gone through some of the reasons why they might not be tonight, either the generalized ones or the more specific targeted ones, which are now more fashionable. He says, even they're not very effective, are they not better than nothing?
No, they're worse than nothing. They are not
even
useless.
The targeted ones?
Some very specific diplomatic measures against individuals may be very useful, and if they're very micro-targeted, they can be useful. Yes, but the kinds of sanctions that we're talking about, say in Venezuela, I think are a good example of how you actually exacerbate the problem. And I'd like, if I may, just to come back for a second to that question, not least because both of the questioners are very distinguished people. I know them both, and it's great that you have quality as well as quantity in this audience.
It is the Spectator, Dan. I don't think you should
where else.
Surprised.
So, but Venezuela, I think, is a very neat case in point. First of all, the sanctions were already being used pretty much globally by Chavista fellow travelers and enthusiasts before they'd been applied. So when the when the Venezuelan economy began to collapse once the spike in oil was past, the go-to excuse for every Marxist sympathizer in every British university, in the left bank, and all over the world was, oh, this is a kind of, a CIA hit job, sabotage, sanctions, all the rest. At that stage, there were almost no, I think there may have been some restrictions on buying Venezuelan government debt, but that was it, right? And again, it's a slightly odd thing. If I were a CIA operative and my job were to sabotage the Venezuelan economy, what would I do? I mean, I turn up and I open my laptop. It's actually remarkably difficult, right? As we've seen, you began the whole debate by saying we've had sanctions for years in some of these places, and they're doing very well. But as the questioners correctly imply with the example they give about the illicit trade in gold and petroleum, what happens when you are a sanctioned country is you kind of join this club, a pretty unappealing club with Russia and Iran and all the rest of it. But they kind of close ranks and they create what Tom Burgis just ably called a big global black market that is operating outside all of the normal methods and laws of global trade. And so the one thing we know about operating in that black market is that it doesn't benefit any ordinary people. Because it's an illicit kind of cartel, it's just like the drugs trade. You're gonna create fortunes for a few connected individuals, cronies of the regime and their families, but you're not going to have any benefit for the wider population. And that, in a nutshell, is why sanctions are worse than useless. Free trade is a way of lifting ordinary people, ending poverty, spreading the benefits. Sanctions or any other trade restrictions tend to funnel the benefits and hurt the wrong people.
Tom Tugendhat, do you agree with Dan Hannan that sanctions, he's obviously against the generalized ones, but he seems also to be against most of the targeted ones. He says they could only really work at the margins. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think there's certainly a role for some sanctions, as I say, in protecting ourselves. I mean, the flow of dirty money through the UK, whether that's buying property or, as you raised it, paying for education or various other things, can corrupt our own systems, can undermine our own democracy, and can weaken our own defense. So I think there's certainly an element of sanctions there, but I'd see that more as national security related. But in terms of actually changing state policy, I mean, it's quite clear that, sanctioning one of the richest men in China, Chairman Xi, is not going to change Chinese state policy significantly, nor would sanctioning President Putin in Russia. And so there, I think that he's got a very good point, which is, as Dan says, handing control of economic levers to fewer and fewer people is guaranteed to result in one thing, which is the greater enrichment of those few. And it will look, even if it's not the reality, it will look as though those sanctioning are simply doing it in order to empower those few. And so it's certainly something that one should be extremely cautious of.
I'd add one category where I think sanctions are valid, and that is, for example, in the case of China, if you have a prohibition on slave-made produce, that it seems to me is a legitimate and proportionate way of trying to reduce a barbarity in another country.
Maya Lester, is it the function of sanctions? I mean, Tom Tugendhat is mentioning two things really there about sanctions. One is as a tool of foreign policy, and the second is to try and clean up the laundromat reputation of London and its own viron. Do we have evidence that sanctions have worked in either case?
Now, I think, as I said in my opening remarks, it's really dangerous to conflate sanctions with law enforcement or even with national security. So the problem that a number of panelists have rightly identified is the problem of dirty money, as it were, being able to circulate too freely in London. And you made the point that, is actually fighting financial crime in London a priority area, or do we actually quite like the funds in London? I think this is a really serious issue because serious fraud is not very actively prosecuted in the United Kingdom, and obviously should be. Is there, we ask ourselves, a lack of government desire to do so? Is it a problem of underfunding, as Tom Burgis suggests? Interesting problem, but I think it's certainly a problem. However, what is very problematic is using sanctions where we should be using law enforcement. Now, clearly, this is only for cases where we can use law enforcement, and that's basically where there is a UK connection. So we're talking about the problem in the United Kingdom. The problem, it seems to me, with using sanctions, by which we mean basically asset freezes and travel bans, there are several problems. First of all, the standards drop immediately. We're not talking anymore about criminal trials with proper standards of evidence. We're talking about a much lower threshold, which creates serious problems where we're setting an example to the rest of the world. But the other problem is, where does it end? If we start putting people on sanctions lists, these are non-state actors because they've done something wrong, and that is opened up beyond the UK, we're going to be in the business where we have a never-ending, people that we regard as bad being sanctioned by the United Kingdom on the basis of very low thresholds of evidence. And that, I think, is not a place we want to get to. I want to just make a couple of very brief points. First of all, I didn't wish to suggest that sanctions don't ever work. The main point I want to make is that we don't analyze whether they work in advance very effectively, and we don't have a clear strategy for determining how it is that they're supposed to work. But I do think it's significant, and we know this, that President Putin is bothered by sanctions. We also know that China is bothered by sanctions, which is exactly why we have the statement that Tom Burgis referred to, where we get counter sanctions, but also, well, should we start getting less dependent on the dollar? Now, it seems to me that, when people are bashing President Trump's door down to try to get sanctions lifted, that must be because in some sense they are hurting. And I think, sanctions on Russia, much maligned, there is to some extent a strategy, which is if we place sufficient pressure on the state-owned banks and financial institutions, that will cost the state dear. But so what we don't have is a very clear analysis of how are they supposed to work and are they working? And indeed, as today has clearly highlighted, the relationship with trade policy, and that also needs studying. And just finally, I also don't want to give the impression that we're in a due process black hole. So it's definitely not the case that people are just added to lists with no due process at all. That used to be the case, and post 9/11, alleged terrorists were rounded up and put on financial sanctions lists with literally no reasons given. Now, the UK's new sanctions legal framework does have a process for judicial challenge, for evidence being released and so on. But it's a process which is appropriate to the sort of foreign policy framework, and not, I think, one that's appropriate given the very, very significant impact that it can have on those who are subject to sanctions. Finally, just a quick correction. Dan Gertler still is subject to US sanctions. What happened was he had a license granted to him by the US authorities for a year to be able to do certain things with his funds. And it was that license that was revoked. But he is still very much subject to sanctions in the United States.
Tom, I see you want to come back there, Tom Burgis.
Well, but Maya, just on that point, I mean, that's why I said the sanctions were effectively relaxed. Yeah, I agree that he is still technically subject to Magnitsky sanctions, but he only needed a license for one day to move all his money out of the US. And the Biden administration, I believe, has now revoked that license. But in real terms, what happened was through clandestine lobbying efforts, Gertler was freed from the effect of those sanctions for a period of time, and that the big worry was that was long enough for him to do whatever he did with any assets that may have been frozen.
Well, so this again highlights just another problem I want to reiterate. I won't say anything about the specifics of that case, but what I will say is you contrast the case of someone who's added to a sanctions list with someone who's subject to a criminal process and prosecution. And the truth is, if someone is added to a sanctions list and they strongly deny what is said against them, then they can be added to a sanctions list, and journalists and anyone around the world and the public at large will think that what is said about them is correct. It has an incredibly far-reaching effect on reputation. And my point is that is not something that should be encouraged, where when you're making allegations as serious as grand corruption, somebody is normally entitled to full due process of law.
All right. We're coming to the end now of our discussion on sanctions. Just two comments here, one from James Arnold. It says sanctioned states find themselves members of a sanctions club. It effectively means that you build a coalition against the West. And another point which resonates too from Wonky Hills, saying, isn't the underlying context for this debate the shift in the balance of power away from Western powers? Now, this brings me to the final point, which I'll get you all to comment on. Something Tom Burgis said very on resonated with me a lot, because he said we should see this in the context of an undeclared and unconventional war with authoritarianism. And for me, the history of the 21st century so far, which was meant to be the century that saw the ultimate triumph of democracy, the first 2 decades have been the consolidation and indeed expansion of authoritarianism, certainly the growing confidence of authoritarianism. And of course, it is authoritarian regimes to which we take sanctions.
He's absolutely right on the fact that there is a rise in authoritarianism. And for the first time, there is very little correlation, or sorry, there is a decreasing correlation between rule of law and wealth. There was a very interesting article written by James Canagosorium that was published in Medium a number of months ago that highlighted the trend going the other way. And the real question, I think, therefore, for all of us has to be, where do democracies stand and what does it mean to stand up for the rule of law? And this is exactly where some of us have been talking about looking at GATT in 1947 and remembering that it wasn't actually initially set up as a trade deal. It was actually a deal to resist Soviet imperialism that used trade as a leverage. And today we need to think hard about how do we use trade? And this Dan's spoken about very powerfully already, and Maya has spoken, Tom has spoken differently about, is using trade as a liberator, not just as an enricher, and using it to defend the values that we think matter, the freedoms of association, of expression, the liberties that we think are important to us as citizens, and therefore using it to actually push back on autocracies. Because instead what we've done is we've opened up trade to the autocracies, demonstrating what perhaps our ancestors knew in 1947-48, was that if you trade with the Soviet Comintern, you end up importing their values, not just their goods.
And what really worries me about this is that, I mean, Andrew, of course, is right. There has been a shift to altogether more authoritarian regimes. China is the only major economy that is bigger now than it was a year ago. Weirdly, you would think if you were a visitor from another planet that in terms of the texture of daily life, that Russia and China were much more sort of liberal places than Britain, you know, in terms of the daily restrictions. And what really worries me is the readiness as we come out of the lockdown for us to abandon our traditional freedoms here. A little bit like after, as you say, after 1945, we found that powers that we'd surrendered to the state on a supposedly contingent basis for the purpose of the war were then not returned when the peace came. You know, we had identity cards until 1952, we had food rationing until 1954, we had full conscription until 1960, and when it came to the economics, we really had the command economy in place in some areas until the Thatcher reforms. Indeed, in some aspects of healthcare and education, we still have bits of it today. And my worry is that coming out of the epidemic and the lockdowns, we will see a similar demand for the smack of firm government, that people are not just acquiescing in the loss of their liberties, they're demanding it. And that, to me, is the biggest authoritarian danger of all. It's not just a geopolitical one, it's an internal one happening within our countries and indeed within ourselves.
But that's what hostile state agents are pushing here too. We do know, and this is where Maya's point about dirty money and the use of law is, of course, entirely valid, but not totally valid, because actually some of the sanctions are genuinely sanctions in terms of national security. We know of individuals taking money in order to undermine us directly, in the same way as some would plant a bomb, some plant disinformation, and some use corruption.
And we've almost come to the end of our time, but I'd just like a final word from Maya, then from Tom Burgis. Maya, you first.
Just on your interesting question about authoritarian regimes, 2 comments. One, I think the point about needing strategy and needing to study likely impacts, it goes even more strongly where we're talking about trying to impose sanctions on authoritarian regimes, because of course, the sanctions premise, particularly of targeted sanctions, is that if you impose enough pressure on people, they will rise up and they will, elect a different leader, or they will start pressuring their leaders to change policy. Now, that strategy needs very careful consideration when we're not dealing with democratic regimes. So I absolutely agree. But second and final point is, do we not think that, yes, there is a rise of authoritarian regimes, but perhaps listening to Dan Hannan's point about the trade bill and the discussions in Parliament, and indeed among the general public, that businesses and consumers are far more aware of serious abuses of human rights by those authoritarian regimes? And might that not present an opportunity to explore other tools than sanctions, which is perhaps a debate for another evening?
All right, Maya, thank you for that. Final quick word, please, from you, Tom Burgis.
Very quickly, I'd just say that maybe we should remember that one man's free trade is another man's energetic embrace of dictatorship. Look at the countries we've been talking about tonight: Iran, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Russia, UAE. What do they have in common? They're all petrostates. We complain about their corruption, but we, by which I mean in each of those cases, Western multinationals in whom all our pensions are invested, pump their oil and do business with their dictatorships. And it's actually the petro economy that creates the worst kleptocracies. And until we turn off our addiction to oil, that's not going to change.
Right, thank you for that, Tom. We'll leave it there. Tom Tugendhat, Dan Hannan, Maya Lester, Tom Burgis, thank you all for being such a splendid panel tonight on our discussion on sanctions. Thanks to the Initiative for Free Trade for sponsoring this event and making it possible. And of course, thanks to the audience, many of you out there, for watching and for sending in your questions. You can rewatch and share today's discussion because it's going to be posted on Spectator TV's YouTube channel. So that's Spectator TV on YouTube. And you can watch it, go back over the points, share it with your friends. But for all of you watching, for all of you participating, that's the end of our show for Spectator TV for now. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.